and I reserve the balance of my time.
And I close by just thanking you for your time, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 30 seconds to say that since 1996, the disapproval process described by the gentleman from Texas has succeeded just one time. During that time, tens of thousands of regulations have been passed. And if people think that all but one of them were just fine, I would suggest it's just the opposite, that the process right now, the inability of the Congress to rein in regulations that are out of control is lacking, and that's why we need the REINS Act, so that regulations that cost more than $100 million come back to the Congress for approval. It's now my pleasure to recognize a distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee and the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Virginia's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to address, too, what my colleague from Houston, Texas, just said. You know, I love clean air, clean water, safe working places as much as she does. But we've got a government now that instead of working with the people, with industry, is working against them. The trust in our government is at an all-time low. Scandal after scandal is plaguing the government. We have got to get people who are accountable in charge of those regulations, not unelected bureaucrats writing regulations that only in the history of the Review Act have been overturned one time. That was ergonomic furniture was the only time that was able to work. But what I want to talk about is the Constitution. The Constitution granted this body, the House of Representatives, and our colleagues across the Capitol, the Senate, the legislative power in this country, the power to write laws and make rules that the American people must abide by. Now, for a variety of reasons, past Congresses has delegated this part. I mean, it makes sense. I don't know how many parts per billion of whatever substance in water is safe and what isn't. I don't know how many feet high a barrier needs to be to keep our workers safe. We've given this authority to our regulatory agencies. But under this president in particular, but even past presidents, these agencies have seized that power and written more and more burdensome regulations going beyond the intent of this body. Before we burden the American people with expensive, burdensome, and intrusive regulations, the American people have a right to have their elected officials vote on it. This is how we are starting to reclaim some of the power that past Congresses have given away and bring it back to where our founding fathers rightfully intended, into the halls of Congress. You know, this is a rational way to do it. Washington works best under pressure. We give ourselves a deadline. If there's a bad rule that comes up under the REINS Act, we'll get to it and we'll approve it if it's good. We'll disapprove it. It's bad. That's our job. That's what we were sent here to do. That's what our salaries are paid to do. I urge support of this.
Time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to yield an additional minute to the gentleman from Texas.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you very much. I just want to wrap up by saying this really is a problem. Elected officials are not making the rules. There's no accountability, and it's going to be hard for us to do it. This is the first step in bringing the power back to the people and their elected representative. The REINS Act is a common-sense way to hold government accountable and start to rebuild that trust that the American people have lost in Washington, D.C. And that is what is good for America, and I urge my colleagues to support the REINS Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee.
I would reserve what few precious minutes and seconds I may have left. I would like to be informed of how many precious minutes and seconds I have.
Gentleman from Tennessee has 2 minutes.
That's great. Thank you.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Virginia for yielding. And for bringing this bill forward. I'm a strong supporter of the REINS Act, and if you look at why we're bringing this bill forward, it's because of the onslaught of radical regulations that have been coming from this Obama administration for the last 4.5 years. You know, every time I go back home and talk to small business owners in my district, the biggest impediment that they tell me they have to creating more jobs, the biggest impediment are the rules and regulations coming down from the federal government. And if you look at what the REINS Act does, it doesn't stop those rules and regulations. It just says if these rules and regulations are so important and have a $100 million impact on our economy, shouldn't they come before Congress and have to state their case? I mean, what are you so afraid of coming before the public body and having transparency? President Obama said he was going to be the most transparent president ever. Yet he's got these bureaucrats that want to go behind closed doors and come up with rules and regulations. And we have hearings on some of this stuff, by the way. And when they talk about things that are going to save kids' lives and things that are going to improve the quality of our air, we've had hearing after hearing where their rules that they come out with have absolutely nothing to do with improving the quality of people's health. What it has to do with is ramming through a radical agenda that they can't pass through Congress. And if Congress can't pass it, the publicly elected body of the United States government, then you shouldn't go through the back door and have some unelected bureaucrat try to ram that through on this country and cause a devastating impact on jobs. There have been over 130 different major rules under the Obama administration having a $70 billion impact on families in this country. Shouldn't that $70 billion of impact that's going to cost families more money for food, for energy, for everything they do, shouldn't they have to come before the public bodies here in Congress and state the case? If it's such a good rule, what are they afraid of? Why don't they want that transparency? It's because they don't want the transparency. They want to ram through the radical agenda, and the REINS Act just puts a stop to these unelected bureaucrats doing it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee.
I would continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I believe all of the speakers on our side have spoken, except I reserve the right to close, and at this time I would await the gentleman's actions, and then I'll be happy to close myself.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had a good discussion on this bill, and indeed it is Groundhog's Day because we've had it so many times. We've just gone around and around. It's amazing that this body, which I'm so proud to serve in, has popularity ratings among the American public of less than 10% because of the ineffectiveness of the House to work with the Senate and get anything done. And yet here we are trying to give this body more power over the safety and health, physical and physical, of the American public. One of the gentlemen spoke and said, I don't know how tall something has to be, a dam. I don't know. Of course he doesn't know. You leave it to the experts. We pass laws. We instruct the agencies to come up with reasonable rules and regulations and to know how to build dams, to know how to have airplanes that you can get off of in case of a crash and save people's lives, and how to have fire retardant seats and other safety issues. There are safety issues to be abundant for the American public. This is a bad idea. It is an idea that will not create jobs. It will hurt the American public, hurt safety, and possibly our financial safety as well, because it could impede the Dodd-Frank from going in to protect the American public from future financial doom like we almost saw in 2008 with derivatives here in this Congress. So I would ask that we vote no, we protect the American public, and we respect the system that we've had for so many years for safety and health. And I ask for unanimous consent to enter Mr. Conyers' statement that I have here presently.
The request will be covered by general leave.
Thank you. And I yield back the balance of my time and look forward to hearing Mr. Goodlatte's summation.
The gentleman yields the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized for the balance of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a year and a half ago, the President of the United States came to give his State of the Union address here in the House chamber and stood at the podium just below where you're standing right now. And he had a long list of legislative items he wanted the Congress to pass. And at the conclusion of it, he said, and if you don't do it, I will. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But the question that many of us had was, by what authority in the United States Constitution does the President of the United States have the ability to do something that he's come to the Congress to ask to be passed legislatively and to tell us if we don't do it, He's going to do it himself in the executive branch. Well, the way he does it, when he's not stopped by lawsuits and other means, is he simply has regulations passed to accomplish those objectives. And you know what? Thousands of regulations are passed every Congress compared to a few hundred laws that are passed. And all we're asking here today is that for those regulations that cost the American people $100 million or more, that they have to come back here and be approved by the Congress rather than have executive fiat control that. This is the representative democracy here in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate. This is the people's house. We have the authority to pass laws, and we definitely are concerned about the welfare and well-being of our American people. But when we add trillions of dollars in costs to the expenses of American families, $11,000 per family, that's a stunning thing to think about, what money could have been spent on other things. And yes, of course, some of those regulations are necessary, but many of them are not. Many of them needlessly add costs, create an ever-growing bureaucracy in the executive branch, and we need to have ways to rein that in. And the most effective way to do that is to start with the largest regulations. Many people would say, well, we should do it for all regulations, and that ought to be our objective, to make it very clear that we do not want to see regulations passed that are ineffective, that are needless, that add costs. But starting with those that cost more than $100 million, it is absolutely appropriate for the elected representatives of the people to have the final say on whether those regulations are indeed what the Congress intended when they passed the underlying laws upon which those regulations are based. That's all we ask in this legislation. It is reasonable. The American people want it, and this Congress should pass it. I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. The amendment in the nature of substitute recommended by the Committee on Judiciary printed in the bill as modified by the amendment printed in Part A of House Report 113187 shall be considered read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part B of the report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 113187. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187, offered by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 322, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, and a member opposed shall each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring this amendment forward on the REINS Act to simply prohibit the Obama administration from imposing a carbon tax on the United States. If they wanted to impose that kind of tax, they could not do it through regulation. And of course, we've heard the Obama administration, from President Obama to his EPA administrator and others, talking about various forms of taxes on energy that they want to impose, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a cap-and-trade type scheme. They've continued to throw out that opportunity to impose that kind of radical regulation by themselves without action from Congress. And clearly, as we talk about the REINS Act and we talk about any kind of regulation having over $100 million impact on our economy, we want to make it very clear that any attempt to impose a carbon tax would fall under that same definition of major rule, where they could not do it by regulation. And so if you look at what's been studied on this issue Because, again, this idea of a carbon tax has been floating around for a while by the Obama administration. In fact, the National Association of Manufacturers, Mr. Chairman, did a study, and it's titled "The Economic Outcomes of a U.S. Carbon Tax." And let me tell you, it's not pretty, some of the things that they talk about in this study. If the Obama administration had their way and imposed a tax on carbon, for example, manufacturing output in energy-intensive sectors could drop by as much as 15%. We're talking real job losses that would come to this country. What would it do to families in terms of energy costs? How would it affect them? Well, then in the same study, they say in the first year of a carbon tax, just in the first year, we would see an increase in the cost of natural gas by more than 40%. And the price of gasoline at the pump would go up by 20 cents a gallon, just in the first year of a carbon tax. It would have devastating impacts on our economy. Clearly, if you look at what President Obama and his administration officials are doing and saying, they want to keep the door open to impose a carbon tax through regulation. This amendment says absolutely not. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the amendment and yield to myself such time as necessary.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, sir. This is a bad amendment to a bad bill, so it's doubly bad. This would take almost anything that protects the air, the water, the public from carbon emissions away from the opportunity of the EPA to protect us. It takes a situation in many cities, and that Houston, Texas is one, LA is another, but there are lots of cities that have problems with smog, and they have programs that they have to put a price on pollutants that cause urban smog, and these programs are part of state-approved implementation plans through the EPA to protect the air. They are improving the air quality in Houston and in Los Angeles. But under this amendment, if Texas or California ever needed to change these programs, they wouldn't be able to do so. Los Angeles has had enough smog, so has Houston and the rest of the country, and we have to be able to have laws that effectively protect our air. Public health programs are important, and the amendment would risk the ability of EPA also to have its sanctions that they put into place. Right now, EPA, to ensure civil enforcement procedures, that they change their laws every 4 years, the penalties to keep up with inflation so that there are deterrents and effective deterrents. These would stop this from happening, and eventually the deterrents would be less than necessary to stop bad actors from taking risky behavior that causes harm to the environment and harm to humans. We just saw in January Transocean agreed to pay $1 billion to resolve Federal Clean Water Act civil penalty claims for the 3-month-long oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the BP accident there. BP also has got the same risk. And if we don't allow the penalties to be adjusted for inflation, they won't have an effect. The sanctions won't deter bad actors. We saw it in the BP Deepwater Horizon explosion, and we see it as it applies to the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and all those others. The bottom line is this could have unintended consequences, but its intended consequences to protect the oil industry from regulations that imperil the American public. And this is a bad amendment to a bad bill, and would ask us to defeat it, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance. The gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could go back to that National Association of Manufacturers study on the impact of a carbon tax, the gentleman from Tennessee might be interested in knowing that in Tennessee alone, in the first year of a carbon tax, household utilities would go up by 14%, and in fact, they could experience job losses of up to 40,000 lost jobs just in the state of Tennessee in year one, with a 40% increase in their natural gas prices. So I want to point that out and then yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Chairman Goodlatte.
The gentleman is recognized from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This is a good amendment to a good bill, and I support it. By requiring all new major regulations be submitted to Congress for approval, the RAINS Act provides a powerful check on overreaching executive action. This check could not come sooner. The Obama administration increasingly openly is pursuing unilateral regulatory action to thwart Congress's decision not to pass legislation the administration desires. This includes legislation that would impose a carbon tax as part of the administration's climate agenda. The amendment guarantees that no carbon tax can be imposed unless Congress consents to it, no matter how much the Obama administration would like to impose such a dramatic tax by executive fiat. This is the people's house. This is where new public policy should be established, and this amendment is a good one to assure that this is where policy related to carbon taxes are made, not in the administration. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Tennessee.
Are y'all ready to close, I presume?
I'm prepared to close, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, I'll just reiterate that I think this is a bad amendment to a bad bill. It basically puts the interest of special industries, the gas and oil industry particularly, above the American public's health, clean air, and the environment. And if you want to have an earth that we give back to the next generations that's in as good a shape so their lungs can survive in it, you won't be for this type of regulation or for this amendment or for this bill. And I would ask us to vote no.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Yes.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And as I close, I just want to point out that clearly the Obama administration must be very interested in imposing a tax on carbon through regulation. The fact that the opposition has objected to this and stated all of the reasons that they think a carbon tax should be imposed tells you that they are holding out that opportunity. And, of course, if you look at the devastating impacts of a carbon tax, and there are a lot of good studies out there, but again, I go back to the National Association of Manufacturers, very respected national organization, people that stand up for American jobs. The report they did titled Economic Outcomes of a U.S. Carbon Tax are devastating. And clearly the administration wants to do this, but if it's such a good idea, bring the idea to Congress. Bring it through the House. Bring it through the Senate. They could get their floor leaders in the Senate to bring it up tomorrow. But they don't want this kind of scrutiny. Just the other day, the President was in Tennessee bragging about all these new jobs plans that he has, and while he was doing it, ironically, in another state, his new EPA administrator was talking about climate change, and in fact, she called climate change the opportunity of a lifetime. That was her quote. And the EPA would continue to impose regulations despite what we think here in Congress. That's not the way the legislative process works. That's not the system of government our great founders created. They said if an idea is so good, bring it to the people's house, bring it to the Senate, and pass it that way. Don't try to impose it through radical regulation and devastate our economy. I urge adoption, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Pin the chair. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Gentleman asks for a recorded vote.
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 113187. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise or seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-187, offered by Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 322, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield myself 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to offer the bipartisan Davis-Peterson Amendment, which helps address the disconnect between the EPA and our agricultural community. Under our amendment, EPA rules that have a significant impact on a substantial number of agricultural entities as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture would be considered major rules. Under the RAINS Act, major rules need congressional approval. We view this as another way to give agriculture a stronger voice when it comes to EPA regulations. As I travel throughout the 13th District of Illinois and listen to farmers and producers, one of their top concerns is regulatory actions by the EPA. Ag has been a bright spot in our economy For every $1 billion in ag exports, more than 8,000 jobs are supported here at home. With USDA projecting $139.5 billion in ag exports for fiscal year 2013, American agriculture will support more than 1 million jobs. This is a good story, and my colleagues and I on the House Ag Committee do our best to tell it. However, our farmers remain concerned that the EPA does not understand production agriculture. These are concerns that we take very seriously. We aren't the only ones that see this problem. EPA recognizes it as well. Acting Administrator for Water, Nancy Stoner, told me the following when I asked her if her agency was aware of the disconnect between EPA and the agricultural community. Quote, "We are actively working with those groups to improve communication on issues as to which we have had some difficulties. And I will acknowledge that we have had some, and we are doing the very best we can to improve that situation. This amendment provides a solution to the problem by allowing Secretary of Ag to examine EPA regs and identify those that have a significant impact on a significant number of agricultural entities. The USDA must be included in these decisions and equipped with the authority to identify these rules. This agency understands farmers and works best with them on a daily basis. We believe this amendment would improve communication between EPA and USDA. I'd like to yield myself 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for additional 30 seconds.
Would improve communication between the EPA and USDA, give agriculture a place at the table during the process, and ultimately result in getting government out of the way to allow our family farmers to do what they do best. I urge support of this bipartisan amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
To oppose this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, this is just another amendment to take in another area in what's totally a bad concept. The basic concept is that any rule or regulation would have to go through a passage in both the House and the Senate and the presidential approval to become effective. And it would have to happen in committees only on Tuesdays or Thursdays, and within 15 days they'd have to pass it. Basically, this is creating a Rube Goldberg type of legislative mechanism that would thwart the creation of regulations and rules that protect the American public. And that's just plumb wrong. Now, what this does is tries to gut the EPA. And I'm shocked that my good friends on the other side would try to gut the work of one of their great presidents, Richard Nixon. Served in this House, served in the Senate, 4 years as vice president. I think he almost eked out 5 years. He had some kind of ethically challenged problem there when he was president. But he did create the EPA, and he did some good environmental things. And I think those things should be standards for the Republican Party and my folks. They should hold up the EPA and remember Richard Nixon as one of their party standard bearers, one of the men that served probably the longest time in a major capacity as president and vice president, Senate leader, and his work on the House Un-American Activities Committee. We can't forget that in this House. And to forget Richard Nixon and to minimize his work, I'm just amazed, because that's one of the great heroes on the other side of the aisle, I believe. But the EPA is important. It was good work that he gave us, and it shouldn't be gutted. And to make these rules have to go through passage between the House and the Senate, if we know the House and the Senate don't get along, we don't pass things. We did get, I mean, they've mentioned, yeah, we got the loan bill through. That's the first thing we kind of did since we did the violence against women and kind of saved the storm victims of Superstorm Sandy. We really hadn't got much done except for, I forget, a couple of post offices. We agreed on them, and maybe a couple of days with something about some coins for the Hall of Fame or something. But we don't to get these major rules done, it wouldn't happen. So we're jeopardizing the American public, and I would urge us to defeat this as a bad amendment to a bad bill, and it's deleting the legacy of Richard Nixon.
And I reserves his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I respect and thank the gentleman from Tennessee for his comments on Richard Nixon. However, I was not yet in kindergarten when Mr. Nixon served, so therefore I do not remember him creating the EPA, but thank him for reminding me of that. I'd like to yield, Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Congressman Goodlatte.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the gentleman from Illinois for offering this amendment. It's another good amendment. And I also want to say to my good friend from Tennessee that I was a little older when Richard Nixon was in office. We're not minimizing what he did. We're going to maximize the amount of attention that the Congress pays to the EPA when they get it wrong, particularly when the Secretary of Agriculture determines that any regulation issued by the EPA will have a significant impact on a substantial number of agricultural entities. We ought to take a look at that. As a result, it subjects such regulations to congressional approval before they can become effective. This is an important step to rein in what is often regarded as the most overreaching of all federal regulatory agencies. The EPA's actions and proposals have been particularly problematic for America's farmers, including small farmers. This includes, for example, the EPA actions aimed at farm dust. The Secretary of Agriculture has a greater incentive than EPA to assure that potential adverse impacts on agricultural entities have been adequately and accurately assessed. The amendment guarantees that regulations that should be characterized as major due to their impacts on agricultural entities will be so characterized and submitted to Congress for approval, and I urge my colleagues to support this very worthy amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time, and I'm ready to close whenever the ranking member is.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, sir. I too was alive when Richard Nixon was doing his service, and I remember him getting on that helicopter, waving goodbye. There were regulations that made sure that he was able to get away from Washington and get home to California. And we need to make sure those regulations that might be impeded by this REINS Act are still in effect so that presidents like him can make their escape. And I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. And I wonder, even though I don't remember Richard Nixon getting up and flying away, I wonder if the EPA would let that helicopter leave Washington, D.C. today. But I got to tell you, this is a common sense bipartisan amendment that gives our farmers a stronger voice and a better place at the table when EPA is considering these regulations that impact the ag community. And I want to thank Ranking Member Peterson for supporting this effort as well. I urge my colleagues' support, and I want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, to my colleague from Tennessee for making this actually a lively debate tonight, and hopefully a few more viewers on C-SPAN are smiling this evening because of it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113187. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187, offered by Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Pursuant to House Regulation 322, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself enough time.
The chair is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as I have traveled across the 8th Congressional District of Missouri from my hometown of Salem to the Ozark Hills in Wright County, Douglas, Howe County, to the banks of the Mississippi River, one of the largest concerns that my constituents have is the uncertainty surrounding the Affordable Care Act. Individuals are concerned about the relationship with their doctor and what their costs are going to be. Businesses are left with the tremendous uncertainty. They are understaffed because they are afraid to hire additional employees, and they're also firing employees just to fall below the 50 individual threshold. The effects of the Affordable Care Act are adversely affecting the health care and jobs and the folks all across this great country. That is why I'm offering my amendment to revise the definition of major regulations to include any regulation under the Affordable Care Act. With over 3,000 pages of federal regulations already issued and many more to follow, Congress must prevent this widely unsupported law from causing further damage to our health care system. Mr. Speaker, there is broad bipartisan opposition to the Affordable Care Act. The administration has demonstrated its own certainty through the delays to several key provisions of the bill. Congress must assert its role in oversight and give the American people their voice back in government, away from the bureaucrats. My amendment does just that. I urge the adoption of the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is a microcosm of the Congress, this 113th Congress. The macro has been the 40th attempt coming up to repeal Obamacare. And this is a micro to try to defeat Obamacare through a little regulation. It seems like the preoccupation that the other side has with what is one of the most important social safe network provisions passed by this House in history, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and then the Affordable Care Act, is amazing. We've had 40 bills, and now this rule and regulation to try to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act means your child can stay on your insurance until they're 26 years of age. It means that you can't have lifetime caps on your health insurance. It means you can't be denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition. It means that being a woman doesn't classify you as having a pre-existing condition. It says that certain care comes to you, like colonoscopies or mammograms, without a copay. And it means checkups for people, and yearly annual checkups, which could detect disease early and save people's lives. It's a way to provide health care for at least 40 million people in this country who don't have health care. And it has already been shown to drive down the cost of health care. For those states that have worked with us and have exchanges, we've seen reductions in what was expected to be the cost of insurance from 25 to 30 to even 50% in different states. Health care costs are not rising at the rates that they were otherwise because of the fact that we passed the Affordable Care Act and the Patient Protection Act. It's important that individuals get more community health centers, which come with this provision. Lots of people, particularly in my district, they don't live near hospitals and doctors. They need community health centers, and community health centers have been funded and created to give people that opportunity to have access to health care otherwise denied. We're the last industrialized country on the face of the earth to provide health care for its people. The last industrialized country to do so. That is one of the shames that we have tried to cure with this bill. And this provision, this amendment to this REINS Act, would deny people that health care coverage. It would say if you have a pre-existing condition, too bad, you don't get insurance. As President Obama said, the Affordable Care Act is insurance reform on steroids. You want to have the health insurance industry have total control without regulations, without controls, then you don't want to defeat it. But the American public doesn't want that. They want their health care costs to be contained, and they don't want the insurance companies to have total control. They like the idea of their children having insurance up to the time they're 26, and to have preventative care come without copays, not have yearly caps on your insurance or lifetime caps on your insurance benefits that can be paid out. And so this is a sad state that we've spent so much time in this Congress trying to deny people health care and save their lives. So this is a bad amendment. I would ask us to defeat it, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the fine gentleman from Virginia.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I commend him and support this important amendment. The REINS Act restores to Congress the accountability for regulatory decisions that impose major burdens on our economy. This amendment strengthens congressional accountability for regulations under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. You know, Obamacare, that legislation that has 400 new authorities, 400 new ways for the Secretary of Health and Human Services and other bureaucrats to regulate the American people, businesses large and small, local governments, state governments, health care providers. Yeah, that one. Imposed over the will of the American people. Implementation of Obamacare has demonstrated that the Act imposes a detrimental and unworkable reform of the nation's health care system. And one after another, promises made to the American people by the Act's supporters when the law was passed have been broken.
Moreover, the Obama administration's own actions to waive or suspend Obamacare requirements have made clear that regulatory actions to implement the Act form a seamless web. Too often, actions to avoid one adverse effect of the Act's implementation send ripple effects of unfairness or other harmful consequences throughout the Obamacare web, requiring adjustments to other aspects of implementation. This, too, justifies the amendment's requirement that Congress approve any new regulations promulgated under the Act, and I urge my colleagues to support this excellent amendment. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time expired. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you. What this shows is exactly what the situation is. You've got a majority in the House that's against the Affordable Care Act, and you've got a majority in the Senate that's for it. To have any rules and regulations under it go into effect, the House and the Senate would both have to approve it, which means you could have one House, not both houses. The way we work, it's a bicameral legislature, and the House and the Senate have to work together and pass the bill to become law, but one House, by not passing it, could kill it. One House veto. This Republican Congress could veto every single regulation under the Affordable Care Act. And then pre-existing conditions, no insurance, lifetime caps, back in effect, yearly caps, back in effect, child's 23, nope, can't stay on dad and mom's policy anymore. Get hurt, go broke, too bad. That's just wrong. And that's what this would do for any regulations. One House could veto and kill legislation. That's antithetical to the bicameral legislature. That's just one of the many reasons why we should defeat this amendment, defeat the bill, and go on and try to pass a jobs bill and kill sequester. And see that the National Institute of Health, which has cut $1.6 billion by sequester, isn't cut. That's our Department of Defense. They protect us from Alzheimer's, AIDS, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Parkinson's. Those are the enemies. The National Institute of Health is the Department of Defense, and we shouldn't be cutting $1.6 billion from them because we're all going to be victims.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back the balance.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like the rest of my time for the closing.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is truly a jobs bill. When you're looking at over 170,000 pages of federal rules and regulations that affect jobs, this amendment will help alleviate that problem. As I've traveled across the 8th Congressional District, I've had businesses, one after the other, that said they had 56 employees. Well, they were going to reduce those employees because of one piece of legislation that was passed out of this chamber that Congress never even took the time to read till after they passed it, and yet they've even passed it. The problem is the Affordable Care Act. The problem with the Affordable Care Act, it affects more than 1/6 of our nation's economy. 1/6 of our nation's economy. And because of the burdensome regulations that are being promulgated from the Affordable Care Act, businesses are scared to death to hire additional employees, and they are firing additional employees. I've had restaurant owners in our districts that have sold restaurants because they want to fall below the 50-employee mark. Folks, this is a jobs bill. Less government regulation that is breaking the backs of small businesses is what we need to do to turn this country around. With that, Mr. Speaker, I ask this body to adopt this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded votes requested. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 113187. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187. Offered by Mr. Latham of Iowa.
Pursuant to House Regulation 322, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Latham, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While my amendment is very simple, it's aimed at addressing a very complex problem, the problem of duplicative and conflicting federal regulations. In the underlying bill, federal agencies are required to submit, along with the rule they want Congress to approve, a list of other regulatory actions to implement the same statute or regulatory objective. In other words, Mr. Chairman, to actually investigate whether the regulations may be redundant. It's not clear whether the requirement to list other regulatory actions applies only to the promulgating agency or other agencies. The amendment clarifies that this list must include related regulatory actions by any other federal agency. Earlier this year, the GAO delivered to Congress its third annual report on duplication in government programs, identifying 17 specific areas of fragmentation, overlap, and duplication where multiple programs and activities are creating inefficiencies. Unfortunately, these inefficiencies result in regulatory duplication, heaping needless costs and paperwork on businesses at a time when our economy continues to struggle enough already. A group run by former CBO Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin recently compiled information on regulations in the specific problem areas identified by the GAO, using the government database contained by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. This report found 470 related paperwork requirements, 642 million hours of regulatory duplication involving 990 federal forms, and at least $20 billion in compliance costs to employees. Take these examples. We have 3 agencies issuing regulations on catfish inspections at a cost of 2 million work hours and $146 million in compliance costs. 10 different agencies handle Medicare forms submitted by health care providers, generating 486 million hours of paperwork and 281 different forms. 9 different agencies administer higher education assistance program involving 66 federal forms and duplication, resulting in 47 million hours of paperwork at a compliance cost of $3 billion. Congress must act, eliminate or consolidate duplicate and inefficient programs. But in the meantime, agencies must at least acknowledge requirements imposed by other agencies working on the same issues and work to minimize burdens on our small businesses. According to the Small Business Administration, it already costs American businesses at least $8,000 and often more than $10,000 per employee to comply with federal regulations. It's no wonder that the massive federal regulatory regime is consistently cited as a roadblock to job growth and economic recovery. I believe this amendment will help clarify areas of overlap and highlight opportunities for reducing the compliance burden faced by American employers. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Tennessee?
Georgia.
The gentleman from Georgia. Why do you seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to this motion.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it would add yet another onerous and unnecessary burden on agencies and will further stifle agency rulemaking. Among other things, the REINS Act requires that an agency issuing a rule submit reports to Congress and the GAO containing a list of related regulatory actions intended to implement the same statutory provision or regulatory objective as the rule at issue, together with the individual and aggregate economic effects of those actions. This amendment would add to that list actions taken or that will be taken by federal agencies other than the agency issuing the rule to meet the same objectives. Such a requirement means that an agency issuing a rule would now be obliged to survey the vast panoply of federal agencies to determine what other actions are being taken by other agencies before it could issue a rule. Congress did not create agencies, Mr. Speaker, to keep tabs on other agencies. This amendment would only serve to divert already limited agency resources away from protecting the American people. This amendment is just a further effort to derail rulemaking. It's placing another burden on already limited agency resources, and is really just busy work. So for those reasons, I rise in opposition. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Iowa.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to recognize the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Goodlatte.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized
for 1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman from Iowa for yielding, and I support his amendment. Interrelated federal regulations are a common feature of the modern regulatory landscape. Numerous major regulations form part of a web of regulations agencies develop to implement one statutory provision or one statutory goal. In addition, numerous regulatory statutes entrust rulemaking authority over a given problem to more than one agency. This is the case, for example, with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agencies and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' joint authority over wetlands. It is also the case with the EPA's and the Department of Transportation's joint authority over fuel economy standards. The amendment requires that agencies, when they submit new major regulations to Congress for approval, provide a list of related regulatory actions that the submitting agency or other agencies have taken or will take to implement the same statutory provision or regulatory objective. Seems pretty reasonable to me to have to find out what other regulations are impacting the same objective. This helpful amendment will provide Congress with more complete information on the extent of regulatory agencies they have taken or plan to take to implement an authorizing statute or achieve a regulatory goal. That information will better enable Congress to determine whether to approve or disapprove the submitted regulation. This can only improve congressional accountability and the regulatory process, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you. In response, I would point out that with respect to interrelated regulations, different regulatory authorities have different regulatory objectives. And so to require that one agency survey the other to see whether or not there are any similar or the same objectives with no power or authority to decide to do away with a particular regulation based on an objective that is no longer suitable, I think is not something that this amendment allows for, and it's also something that agencies themselves are not equipped to do. I agree that we need to have some mechanism whereby regulatory or regulations can be looked at, modified, strengthened, or weakened, or done away with at any particular time. But this anti-regulatory legislation and this amendment will not accomplish that. And I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
I may inquire as to how much time there is.
The gentleman from Iowa has 15 seconds. The
15.
gentleman from from Georgia has 1.5 minutes.
I would reserve and let the gentleman out.
The gentleman from Iowa reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
I will yield the balance.
The gentleman yields the balance of his time. The gentleman from Iowa.
I thank the chairman. I will just obviously be very brief, but the gentleman was talking earlier about opposing this amendment because it creates busy work for the agencies. What about the busy work that the small businesses to comply with this mountains and mountains of regulations? And I think, like previous speakers have said, the biggest reason that people are not hiring today is because of the cost of regulations. And I would ask for this amendment to be passed.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Recorded vote. As for a recorded vote.
Gentlemen, pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 113187, For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-187, offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas.
Pursuant to House Regulation 322, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I want to yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman yields himself 1 minute and is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Tonight we engage this House to talk about some common sense legislation that would in fact allow the American people and this Congress to understand more about rules and regulations as they are presented that the American people have to live under. And tonight my amendment requires an agency submit the report on any proposed federal rule to include an assessment of anticipated jobs gained or lost as a result of the implementation of any rules that fit within the REINS Act. And this is very important, Mr. Chairman, because many times rules and regulations are implemented without a regard for what the impact would be on the people who have to live under them. We believe this is common sense. We believe this happens in businesses every day, a cost-benefit analysis of the impact of the rules that are written combined with the impact that they would have upon a job, upon job losses, whether it be addition to the government or addition or a loss to the free enterprise system. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? The gentleman from Georgia rise.
I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this amendment presupposes that regulations depress job creation. To the contrary, there is no credible evidence that regulations depress job creation. The majority's own witness at one of our hearings clearly debunked the myth that regulations stymie job creation. Christopher DeMuth of the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, stated in his prepared remarks that the, quote, focus on jobs can lead to confusion in the regulatory debates, end quote. And also he stated that, quote, the employment effects of regulation, while important, are indeterminate, end quote. Nonetheless, I appreciate that this amendment recognizes his amendment that regulations could, I recognize that this amendment recognizes that regulations could create jobs. I am, however, concerned about this amendment because it would add to the analytical burdens of agencies a speculative assessment of jobs added or lost and how many of those jobs would be added or lost to the public and private sectors. To the extent that regulations have anything to do with jobs, H.R. 367's proponents should overwhelmingly support my amendment, which is upcoming, which simply exempts from H.R. 367's congressional approval mechanism all rules that OMB determines would result in net job creation. This way, job-creating rules would not effectively be vetoed, which would be the precise result under H.R. 367. Also, instead of trying to make Congress a super administrative agency, what we should be doing is considering actual job creation legislation. We also should be talking about how to help middle-class families who are struggling financially. And with that, I will reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves the balance of time. The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield a minute and 15 seconds to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for a minute and 15 seconds.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I thank the opportunity to rise in support of this important amendment and
rise in support overall of the REINS Act, a critical tool in the battle against overregulation, which is destroying jobs. The gentleman from Georgia talked about whether or not regulations actually destroy jobs. Well, from my home state of Kentucky, I can tell you we've lost 5,700 coal mining jobs in East Kentucky as a result of this administration's overzealous overregulation of our coal industry. Small business owners from across Kentucky continually tell me that they want to create more jobs and grow their businesses. They want to help put food on the table, gas in the tank, and more money in the pockets of Kentucky families who are hurting under this administration's war on coal. But costly and burdensome regulations coming out of unaccountable federal agencies are raising their cost of doing business, leading to higher prices for consumers, fewer jobs for workers, and weakened American competitiveness. While federal regulations wreak havoc on families in Kentucky, small businesses, and our overall economy, the unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats writing them are hiding behind the fact that they are not always required to fully analyze the impact their proposal will have on jobs. If you want to know about the impact of these regulations on jobs, come to eastern Kentucky and see those lost jobs. The gentleman reserves the balance. Gentleman from Georgia.
In response, Mr. Speaker, I would say that the old ways of creating energy or producing energy, those ways that foul up our environment, that pollute our air and water, and cause health concerns to the people of this great nation. Those types of jobs, fortunately, yield to a brighter day of new, renewable, and clean forms of energy. And that's a growth industry that, if this legislature could only see the brightness of the future, I think we would have a whole lot more jobs created as